bride's parents mocked the groom's father because of his humble profession, considering him unworthy. However, when he revealed his gift to the newlyweds, the guests froze with shock. Subscribe to the channel and write where you're watching this video from. The day had finally arrived, a day that carried the weight of love, unity, and the inevitable clash of worlds. Peter stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie with trembling fingers. The reflection staring back at him was one of a young man determined to build a future with the woman he loved, yet burdened by the shadow of her family's disdain. His dark skin gleamed under the morning light streaming through the window, a stark reminder of the barriers he had faced and would likely face again today. Peter's fiancée, Emily, was everything he could have dreamed of: kind, compassionate, and unfalteringly supportive. She had stood by him through every hurdle, defending their love against the subtle and not-so-subtle objections of her family. Yet, as much as she loved Peter, she couldn't deny the prejudice deeply ingrained in her parents, George and Margaret, and the rest of their affluent, predominantly white family. Today, they would meet Peter's father, Thomas, for the first time, and Peter could feel the tension tightening like a noose around his chest. Thomas had always been a man of quiet dignity. A janitor by trade, he had worked tirelessly to raise Peter alone after the untimely death of his wife. Despite his modest means, Thomas carried himself with a grace that belied the challenges he had faced. To Peter, he was a hero, the man who had instilled in him the values of hard work, humility, and integrity. But Peter knew all too well how people like George and Margaret would perceive his father. The wedding venue was a sprawling estate, the kind that screamed wealth and exclusivity. As Peter and Thomas arrived, stepping out of the modest sedan that Thomas had polished to a shine the night before, they were met with the spectacle of luxury. Glistening cars lined the driveway, and impeccably dressed guests milled about, their laughter mingling with the soft strains of a string quartet. Thomas adjusted his simple yet well-pressed suit, his weathered hands smoothing over the fabric as he surveyed the scene with a mixture of awe and apprehension. Peter noticed the subtle glances cast their way, the whispers that followed them as they made their way toward the main entrance. "Just remember," Peter said quietly, leaning toward his father, "no matter what happens, you're the reason I'm standing here today. None of this would be possible without you." Thomas gave his son a small, reassuring smile. "I'm here for you, Peter. This is your day." Inside, the contrast between the two families was stark. George and Margaret stood at the center of a group of guests, exuding an air of superiority that seemed to infect those around them. Margaret's sharp eyes immediately landed on Thomas, scanning him from head to toe with a critical gaze. George, tall and imposing, approached with an overly polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You must be Thomas," George said, extending a hand. "I've heard a lot about you." Thomas shook his hand firmly. "And you must be George. It's a pleasure to meet you." Margaret chimed in, her tone dripping with condescension. "We've been so curious about Peter's family. Tell us, what do you do for a living?" Thomas met her gaze without flinching. "I work as a janitor. It's honest work, and it's provided for my son and me." A palpable silence fell over the group. George's smile faltered, and Margaret's expression twisted into something resembling pity, though it was laced with disdain. "Well," she said finally, "it's certainly admirable to work hard for one's family." Her words were carefully chosen, but the condescension was unmistakable. Peter clenched his fists at his sides, his jaw tightening as he watched his father endure their veiled insults with unwavering composure. Emily appeared at that moment, her presence a beacon of calm in the storm of tension. She greeted Thomas warmly, her genuine smile cutting through the pretense of the gathering. "I'm so glad you're here, Thomas," she said, taking his hand in hers. "You've raised an incredible son." Thomas's smile softened. "Thank you, Emily. It means a lot to hear that." As the evening progressed, the divide between the two families became increasingly evident. The lavish decor, the expensive menu, the designer outfits, it all served to underscore the disparity between Thomas's humble upbringing and the opulence of Emily's world. Yet Thomas remained steadfast, his quiet dignity a sharp contrast to the arrogance of George and Margaret. He engaged politely with the guests, answering their probing questions about his background with honesty and grace. But the whispers continued, growing louder as the evening wore on. "Did you hear? He's just a janitor," one guest murmured to another. "I can't believe Emily's marrying into that family," another said, her voice dripping with disdain. Peter overheard every word, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. But every time he looked at his father, standing tall and unshaken amidst the scrutiny, he felt a surge of pride. As the night drew to a close, George and Margaret exchanged a knowing glance. They approached Thomas, their smiles as insincere as ever. "Thomas," George began, "we appreciate you coming today. It must be a bit overwhelming, being in a setting like this." Margaret added, "Yes, it's not every day one gets to experience this level of refinement." Thomas met their gazes steadily. "It's certainly a different world," he said evenly. "But I've found that what truly matters isn't the setting, but the people." George and Margaret were momentarily taken aback by his response, but their composure quickly returned. "Well," George said, forcing a chuckle, "I suppose we all come from different walks of life." As they turned to leave, Peter stepped forward, placing a protective hand on his father's shoulder. "You don't have to do this, Dad," he said quietly. Thomas shook his head. "This is your day, Peter. I won't let their ignorance ruin it." But as the wedding day unfolded, the tension continued to build, setting the stage for a confrontation that would lay bare the true character of everyone involved. The grand dining hall shimmered under the glow of crystal chandeliers, the tables adorned with pristine white linens and arrangements of fresh lilies. Guests began taking their seats, the clinking of fine china and hushed murmurs creating an undercurrent of expectation. Despite the opulent surroundings, a palpable tension hung in the air, like a storm waiting to break. Peter and Thomas entered the room together, their presence immediately drawing the attention of Emily's family and friends. The whispers started anew, hushed but sharp, slicing through the air with the weight of judgment. Thomas, ever composed, followed Peter to their assigned table near the front of the room, where Emily's parents, George and Margaret, were already seated. Their expressions were carefully neutral, but their body language, stiff postures, slight averted glances, betrayed their discomfort. Emily was by their side, her warm smile a stark contrast to her parents' frosty demeanor. She gestured to Thomas, inviting him to sit beside her. As everyone settled in, George cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Before we begin, I'd like to welcome you all to this special occasion. Tonight, we celebrate not only the union of Emily and Peter, but also the merging of two families." He paused, glancing briefly at Thomas. "Though we come from different walks of life, I hope we can find common ground." The remark, though framed diplomatically, carried an undercurrent of condescension. Thomas simply nodded, his face unreadable, while Peter bristled beside him. The servers began circulating, placing artfully arranged dishes before the guests. The hum of conversation resumed, but it wasn't long before the focus returned to Thomas. "So, Thomas," Margaret began, her tone light but with an edge that suggested she was probing for sport. "Peter mentioned that you've worked tirelessly to support him. That's admirable. What is it you do again?" Thomas placed his fork down, meeting her gaze with quiet confidence. "I'm a janitor. I've been one for most of my life." The statement hung in the air, followed by an uncomfortable silence. Margaret's perfectly arched eyebrows lifted in a performance of polite surprise. George leaned forward, a tight smile playing on his lips. "A janitor, you say? That's certainly a noble profession," he said, his words laced with insincerity. "It must be fulfilling to know you've done your part, even in such humble circumstances." Peter's hand tightened around his glass, the sound of his knuckles cracking barely audible. Emily placed a calming hand on his arm, though her own frustration was evident in the way her cheeks flushed. Thomas, however, remained unperturbed. "It's honest work," he replied evenly. "It allowed me to raise my son and give him the opportunities he needed to succeed. I wouldn't trade it for anything." Margaret tilted her head, her lips curling into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course. And now look at Peter, a testament to your hard work. Though I imagine Emily's influence has helped polish him a bit." She chuckled lightly, glancing around the table for validation. A few of the guests exchanged amused looks, but Peter's expression darkened. "It's not polishing, Margaret," Peter said, his voice tight with restrained anger. "It's about character, and that's something my father taught me better than anyone." Thomas placed a hand on Peter's arm, gently signaling him to stay calm. "Thank you, son," he said quietly. Turning back to Margaret, he added, "Character is something that's often overlooked, but it's what truly defines a person." The conversation shifted temporarily, but the tension lingered. As the main course was served, another guest, an older man with a commanding presence, leaned forward, his voice cutting through the general murmur. "Forgive my curiosity, Thomas, but how does a janitor raise a son who's accomplished so much? It must have been challenging." Thomas nodded, unflinching. "It was. But challenges shape us. I taught Peter to face them with integrity and resilience, and he's made me proud every step of the way." "Indeed," the man replied, his tone neutral but his expression skeptical. "And yet, I can't help but wonder, what exactly are you bringing to this marriage, Thomas? Surely you've thought about how you might contribute." Before Thomas could respond, Margaret interjected, her voice dripping with faux concern. "Oh, I'm sure Thomas has something planned, though, of course, it's hard to compete with what we've provided." The implication was clear and the table fell silent once more. Emily, unable to hold her tongue any longer, spoke up. "Mother, that's enough. Thomas has already given Peter more than most parents ever could. Maybe we should be focusing on celebrating instead of—" She hesitated, glancing around the table. "Instead of whatever this is." Margaret's smile stiffened, and George gave a placating wave of his hand. Now, Emily. We're just trying to get to know Thomas. It's only natural to ask questions." The meal continued, but the atmosphere grew increasingly strained. Every attempt by Thomas to participate in the conversation was met with thinly veiled barbs or dismissive responses. The other guests, emboldened by George and Margaret's behavior, began to join in, their whispers barely concealed. "Can you imagine? A janitor at an event like this," one woman murmured to her companion. "It's almost laughable." "I wonder what he'll give as a wedding present," another said. A mop, perhaps. Peter heard every word, his temper nearing its breaking point. But it was Thomas's unwavering composure that kept him grounded. His father's calm in the face of such blatant disrespect was a reminder of the strength Peter had always admired. Finally, as dessert was served, George leaned back in his chair, addressing Thomas directly. "Well, Thomas, I suppose we'll find out soon enough what kind of gift you've brought for the happy couple. I'm sure it'll be thoughtful." The remark drew chuckles from several guests, but Thomas merely smiled. "I believe gifts should carry meaning, rather than simply a price tag," he said. "I hope it will be appreciated for what it represents." George opened his mouth to respond, but Emily cut him off. "Enough, Dad. This is supposed to be a celebration, not an interrogation." Margaret raised her glass, forcing a laugh. "Oh, Emily, we're just having a bit of fun. No need to be so serious." The evening drew to a close with the tension still simmering, unspoken yet palpable. As the guests began to disperse, Peter turned to his father, his voice low but firm. "I'm so sorry, Dad. They had no right to treat you that way." Thomas placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "Don't apologize, Peter. They may have their opinions, but they don't define who I am, or who you are. Remember that." As father and son walked toward the exit, leaving behind the opulent dining hall and the judgmental stares of its occupants, Peter couldn't help but feel a growing resolve. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain. His father's unwavering strength and integrity would guide him through. The night, though difficult, was far from over, and the events that followed would test them both in ways neither could have anticipated. The night lingered, thick with tension that clung to the air like fog. The echoes of laughter and whispered judgments from the dinner table followed Peter and Thomas as they moved toward the terrace, seeking respite from the oppressive atmosphere inside. The grand hall, with its shimmering chandeliers and polished silverware, had begun to feel less like a celebration and more like a battlefield. Thomas's steady footsteps carried him across the marble floor, his shoulders squared, but Peter could see the weariness in his father's eyes. It wasn't just the long evening or the endless barrage of subtle insults. It was the weight of a lifetime spent enduring the same treatment over and over again. Peter closed the terrace door behind them, muffling the chatter and music. The cool night air offered a brief reprieve, but it did little to calm the storm brewing inside him. "Dad, I don't know how you do it," Peter said, his voice tight with frustration. "They disrespected you all night, and you just took it." Thomas leaned against the stone railing, gazing out over the manicured gardens illuminated by rows of flickering lanterns. "I didn't take anything," he said evenly. "I chose not to give them the reaction they wanted." Peter shook his head. "But why? Why not stand up to them? Let them know they can't talk to you like that." Thomas turned to face his son, his expression calm but resolute. "Because tonight wasn't about me. It's about you and Emily. If I let them drag me into an argument, it would have ruined everything, and I won't let their ignorance take that from you." Peter opened his mouth to respond, but the terrace door swung open and Emily stepped outside, her face drawn with concern. "There you are," she said softly. "I was worried when you both left." Peter took her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "We just needed a break." Emily's gaze shifted to Thomas. "I'm so sorry about my parents. I knew they'd be difficult, but I didn't think they'd be this cruel." Thomas offered her a small smile. "It's not your fault, Emily, and it's nothing I haven't faced before." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "But it's not right. I hate how they made you feel, how they made me feel." I wanted this night to be perfect, but they showed you who they are," Thomas interrupted gently. "And now you have a choice. What matters most is how you respond." Before Emily could reply, the terrace door opened again, this time revealing George, his towering frame silhouetted against the warm light spilling from inside. His smile was tight, forced. "Ah, here you are," he said, stepping closer. "I thought we might have lost you. Emily, dear, we're about to start the toasts. You should come inside." Emily hesitated, looking back at Thomas and Peter. "I'll be there in a minute," she said. George's eyes flicked to Thomas, his smile faltering. "And Thomas," he added, "perhaps you'd like to say a few words as well? It might help everyone get to know you better." Peter bristled, hearing the condescension behind his words, but Thomas simply nodded. "I'd be honored," he said. George's smile sharpened. "Good. We'll be waiting." When he was gone, Emily let out a frustrated sigh. "He's not asking you to speak because he cares what you have to say," she said. "He's setting you up." Thomas's smile was faint but reassuring. Let him try. Moments later, they returned to the hall where glasses were raised and conversations dimmed as George tapped his fork against his champagne flute. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying through the room, "thank you all for joining us tonight to celebrate this wonderful occasion. It's not every day that two families come together in such a meaningful way." He paused, his eyes landing on Thomas. "And, speaking of family, I think it's only fitting that we hear a few words from Peter's father, Thomas. After all, he's the man who raised the groom and helped shape him into the man we see before us today." The words might have sounded sincere if not for the slight smirk playing at the corners of George's mouth. Thomas rose slowly, the room fallen silent as all eyes turned to him. "Thank you, George," Thomas began, his voice steady, "and thank you all for welcoming my son and me tonight. I know our backgrounds are different, but I believe this union is proof that love can bridge any divide." Some of the guests smiled politely, while others exchanged knowing glances, clearly expecting him to fumble or falter. But Thomas continued, his tone unwavering. "I've spent my life working hard, not for recognition or wealth, but to give my son a chance at a better future. I may not have the kind of success that's measured in dollars, but I've succeeded in raising a man who values integrity, kindness, and perseverance. And tonight, I couldn't be prouder to see him standing beside the woman he loves." For a brief moment, a ripple of genuine applause filled the room, but George wasn't finished. "That's a beautiful sentiment," he said, standing once more, "and I'm sure Peter appreciates everything you've done for him. But I have to ask, Thomas, what kind of example do you think you're setting? After all, success isn't just about values. It's also about ambition. Don't you think Peter deserves a family that can offer more than humility?" The room fell silent again, but this time the tension was sharper, more dangerous. Thomas looked George in the eye and smiled. "I think Peter deserves a family that knows the difference between humility and weakness," he said, "because humility isn't about thinking less of yourself. It's about thinking of others more. And tonight, I see two people who've built their relationship on love, respect, and understanding. That's more than I can say for some." The room shifted uneasily, and Margaret quickly rose, raising her glass. "To the happy couple," she declared, forcing a smile. The guests echoed the toast, but the mood had shifted. Thomas's words lingered, leaving an undercurrent of discomfort and reflection. As the evening wore on, Peter couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. His father had faced the storm with grace, but the battle wasn't over. And as he glanced at Emily, who stood defiantly beside him, he knew they would face whatever came next, together. The night pressed on, but the weight of Thomas's words still lingered in the air like the aftershocks of an earthquake. The clinking of glasses and forced laughter rang hollow, failing to mask the tension that simmered just beneath the surface. Thomas remained at the table, his expression calm but guarded, while Peter sat beside him, shoulders tight with barely restrained anger. Emily hovered close, her presence a silent reassurance, as if her nearness alone could shield them from the storm swirling around them. Across the room, George and Margaret regrouped with their friends, their hushed voices carrying faint echoes of indignation. Margaret's eyes darted toward Thomas every few seconds, as though expecting him to make some misstep that would justify their disdain. George, however, seemed more calculated, his gaze fixed and unyielding, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. Peter leaned closer to his father. "I don't trust him," he whispered. "He's not done. I can feel it." Thomas didn't look up. "Let him say what he wants," he replied softly. "Truth has a way of shining through, no matter how much they try to bury it." Before Peter could respond, George rose from his seat and strode toward their table, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. The conversations around them faded as eyes began to follow his movements, curiosity and anticipation stirring among the guests. "Thomas," George began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man accustomed to command. "If I may, there's something I've been meaning to ask you all evening." Thomas turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "Of course." George clasped his hands behind his back, his posture stiff and deliberate. "You spoke earlier about hard work and values, and while I respect that, I can't help but wonder, why a janitor?" A ripple of murmurs swept through the crowd. Emily's face flushed with embarrassment, but before she could speak, George pressed on. "I mean, no disrespect," he continued, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But a man with your composure, your ability to speak with such conviction, you seem capable of so much more. So why settle for cleaning floors?" Thomas's eyes never wavered. "I didn't settle," he said. "I made a choice." George raised an eyebrow. "A choice? To spend your life pushing a mop?" "A choice to take care of my family," Thomas corrected. "To make sure my son had food on the table and a roof over his head. A choice to teach him that no work is beneath a person's dignity." For the first time, George faltered, but he recovered quickly. "And what about before that? Surely there's more to your story than what you've shared tonight." The words hung heavy in the air, and for the first time, Thomas hesitated. Peter frowned, sensing his father's unease. "Dad?" Thomas drew a breath and stood, his gaze sweeping the room before returning to George. "You want to know more about my past?" he said, his voice steady but carrying an edge that silenced the whispers around them. "Fine. Let me tell you." The room hushed as Thomas began to speak. "I wasn't always a janitor," he said. "Before this, I served in the military. I enlisted when I was 18, barely out of high school, because I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to protect the people I loved. And, for a time, I did." Eyes widened. Guests leaned in, their curiosity piqued. Even George seemed momentarily thrown off balance. "I served 2 tours overseas," Thomas continued. "I saw things I wouldn't wish on anyone, things that changed me forever. But I kept going because I believed in what I was doing. I believed in this country." He paused, his voice lowering. "And then I came home." The silence in the room deepened, the weight of his words sinking in. "I came home to a country that didn't see me as a hero," Thomas said. "It saw me as a black man, a man who could risk his life for freedom abroad but still be treated as less than human at home. The medals I earned didn't matter. The sacrifices I made didn't matter. All people saw was the color of my skin." Margaret shifted uncomfortably while George's jaw tightened. "I tried to find work," Thomas continued, "but doors kept closing. I swallowed my pride and took the first job that would pay the bills. I became a janitor, not because it was all I could do, but because it was what I had to do." He looked directly at George. "And I kept going, not because I was weak, but because I was strong enough to put my family first." A scattered murmur rippled through the crowd. Some guests looked down, clearly ashamed, while others avoided Thomas's gaze altogether. "And now," Thomas finished, "I stand here not as a man who's ashamed of his work, but as a man who's proud of what he's built. A son who's kind, intelligent, and successful. That's my legacy." Applause broke out, hesitant at first but growing louder as more guests joined in. Peter stood beside his father, his chest swelling with pride. Emily wiped at her eyes, her expression one of admiration, but George's face darkened. He raised a hand, silencing the applause. "That's quite the story," he said, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "But forgive me if I find it a bit convenient." Thomas frowned. "Convenient?" "Hero or not," George said, "you're still a man who settled. And frankly, I don't think that's the example my daughter needs in her life." The words struck like a slap, and the room fell silent once more. "Enough," Emily said, her voice shaking. "I won't let you talk to him like that." George turned to her, his face hard. "Emily, I'm only thinking of what's best for you." "No," she said firmly, "you're thinking about what's best for you, and I won't stand for it." Peter stepped forward, his arm around Emily's shoulders. "Neither will I." For the first time all evening, George seemed at a loss for words. Margaret tugged at his arm, her expression pleading, but he didn't move. Thomas, however, placed a hand on Peter's shoulder, gently pulling him back. "This isn't the time for anger," he said. "It's the time for truth." The room held its breath as Thomas turned back to George. "You wanted to know who I am," he said. "Now you do. The question is, can you live with it?" George's face hardened, but he said nothing. And as the night continued, the cracks in his carefully constructed world began to show. The air in the hall still trembled with the echoes of Thomas's revelation. Conversations flickered to life again, but they were hushed, uncertain, as if the weight of his story lingered in every corner of the room. Thomas remained seated, his back straight, his expression calm but distant. Peter sat beside him, his jaw tight as he scanned the room, catching glimpses of nervous glances and whispered comments. Emily stood close, her arm looped protectively through Peter's, her eyes darting toward her parents. George and Margaret were huddled at the far end of the hall, their expressions a blend of indignation and disbelief. Margaret wrung her hands, clearly unsettled by the sudden shift in perception, while George's jaw was set, his eyes locked on Thomas like a predator circling its prey. It was clear that neither of them intended to let the evening end on Thomas's terms. Margaret leaned closer to her husband. "We can't let him get away with this," she hissed. "He's trying to turn this into his victory lap." George's lips thinned. "We won't. Trust me." Moments later, George strode purposefully toward the microphone at the front of the room, his footsteps echoing loudly enough to draw attention. He tapped the microphone, the sound reverberating through the hall and silencing the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," George began, flashing the kind of polished smile that had won him many a corporate deal, "let's not allow the evening's emotions to distract us from the reason we're here, to celebrate the union of our children." Polite applause followed, but it lacked enthusiasm. "And what's a celebration without gifts?" George continued, his tone light but pointed. His eyes flicked to Thomas. "I, for one, am curious to see what the father of the groom has prepared for this occasion. After all, gifts tell us a great deal about what we value, don't they?" A ripple of laughter coursed through the crowd, sharper than it should have been. Thomas rose slowly, his calm demeanor unchanged despite the challenge in George's words. Peter shot his father a concerned glance, but Thomas gave him a slight nod, signaling that he had everything under control. Thomas stepped forward, holding a large package wrapped in plain brown paper. Compared to the gleaming boxes and ribbon-tied envelopes scattered across the gift table, it looked almost out of place. Too simple, too modest. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as Thomas carried it to the front of the room and set it down with deliberate care. "This," Thomas began, resting his hands gently on the package, "is a piece of my family's history. It's a reminder of where we've come from and what we've endured to get here. But more importantly, it's a symbol of the values I hope Peter and Emily will carry into their marriage: strength, resilience, and love." He stepped back, motioning for Peter and Emily to unwrap it. The couple exchanged a glance before carefully peeling away the paper. As the wrappings fell to the floor, a collective gasp rippled through the audience. It was a painting, a breathtaking landscape, rich with color and life. The brushstrokes were intricate, alive with motion, capturing the essence of nature in a way that seemed almost ethereal. But what truly caught everyone's attention was the signature scrawled in the bottom corner: Henri Delacroix. The room fell deathly silent as the implications began to sink in. Henri Delacroix was not just any artist. He was one of the most revered African-American painters in history. His works were considered national treasures, and their value had skyrocketed over the years. Owning one was not only a mark of cultural prestige, but also a testament to extraordinary wealth. Margaret was the first to recover, her voice trembling as she asked, Is this real?" Thomas nodded. "It's been in my family for generations, passed down from my great-grandfather, who was a close friend of Delacroix. He gave it to my family as a gesture of gratitude for the support they gave him during his early career." Gasps rippled through the crowd again, followed by whispers that bordered on disbelief. George's face went pale, his composure cracking for the first time that evening. "You mean to tell me," George said, his voice strained, "that you've had this fortune in your possession all these years?" Thomas met his gaze evenly. "Yes. And you still chose to work as a janitor?" George's voice rose, disbelief giving way to anger. "You could have sold this and lived comfortably? You could have—" "Could have what?" Thomas interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "Abandoned the values my parents taught me? Taught my son that money was more important than integrity? I chose to keep this painting because it's more than just a piece of art. It's a piece of my family's story, and that's something I'll never put a price on." The crowd fell silent again, but this time the mood had shifted. The whispers were no longer mocking, but admiring. Guests began to murmur words like remarkable and inspiring. Even those who had laughed at Thomas earlier now seemed unsure, their expressions tinged with guilt. Margaret stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the painting as if seeing it might change her opinion. "You mean to tell me," she said, her voice brittle, that you've been sitting on something this valuable and never thought to what? Flash it around to earn respect? Thomas cut in. Respect isn't something you buy, Margaret. It's something you earn. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. George, however, wasn't ready to concede. This doesn't change anything, he snapped. You're still a man who raised a son you're clearly not good enough to deserve, Emily interrupted sharply. The room froze. George turned to his daughter, his face reddening. Emily, you don't mean that. I do, she said, her voice steady. You've spent the entire night trying to tear Thomas down, but all you've done is show me how small-minded you really are. And I'm done letting you ruin this day. Peter stepped beside her, taking her hand. So am I. The finality in their words hung heavy in the room. George and Margaret looked at each other, their expressions a mix of shock and helplessness, but it was too late. The tide had turned. Thomas stepped forward, resting a hand on Peter's shoulder. I don't need anyone's approval, he said, his voice carrying through the room, and neither do you. Stand tall, son. You've earned it. As the applause began, first tentative and then growing stronger, George and Margaret retreated to the back of the room. For the first time in their lives, they were no longer in control. And for the first time that night, Thomas allowed himself to smile, not in triumph, but in quiet, unwavering pride. The applause lingered, a wave of sound that rippled through the hall, but it carried a weight far heavier than celebration. It was not the kind of clapping that followed a performance or a practiced speech. It was raw and uncertain, born out of a collective reckoning. Some guests clapped hesitantly, unsure whether to align themselves with Thomas's quiet dignity or with the wealth and power that George and Margaret still represented. Others remained silent, their gazes fixed on the floor, unwilling to meet the eyes of the man they had ridiculed only moments before. Thomas remained at the front of the room, his steady hands resting lightly on the frame of the Delacroix painting, as though grounding himself in its history. Beside him, Peter and Emily stood shoulder to shoulder, their unity as a couple more evident than ever. Across the hall, George and Margaret lingered at the edge of the crowd, their carefully curated confidence unraveling thread by thread. But the night wasn't over. Not yet. George stepped forward, his face pale but his voice forced into steadiness. I think we've let emotions get the better of us tonight, he said, raising his hands as though trying to calm the room. Let's not lose sight of why we're here, to celebrate love and family. The words rang hollow, and George seemed to realize it. His eyes darted toward the painting, then back to Thomas. And while this gift is unexpected, I think it's important to remember that material possessions, no matter how valuable, don't define who we are. It was a desperate attempt to regain control, but Thomas didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped forward, his presence commanding the room without effort. You're absolutely right, George, Thomas said, his voice calm but resonant. Material possessions don't define us. Our actions do. The choices we make when no one is watching. The way we treat people when there's nothing to gain. The room fell silent. Even George seemed momentarily frozen, as if the ground beneath him had shifted and he was struggling to regain his footing. I didn't give this painting as a display of wealth, Thomas continued. I gave it because it represents something far more valuable than money. History, resilience, and the sacrifices of those who came before us. It's a reminder that true worth isn't found in what we own, but in what we stand for. A murmur of agreement swept through the crowd. Margaret's lips thinned, her carefully applied lipstick no longer masking the tension in her expression. Thomas's gaze swept the room. But tonight isn't about me. It's about Peter and Emily, their love, their future. And what I want more than anything is for them to build a life based on respect and understanding. Because love, real love, doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care about the color of your skin or the size of your bank account. It endures because it's built on trust. He paused, his eyes landing on George. And trust is something you can't fake. George flinched, but Thomas wasn't finished. I've spent my life proving myself, Thomas said, as a soldier, as a father, as a man. And I'll continue to prove myself every day if that's what it takes to protect my family. But I won't apologize for who I am. Not to you, not to anyone. The applause this time was louder, more certain. It rolled through the hall like thunder, and this time no one hesitated to join in. Even some of George's friends, wealthy, privileged, and previously smug, clapped along, perhaps recognizing the sincerity in Thomas's words, or perhaps fearing they'd be judged for remaining silent. But George stood stiffly, his face a mask of frustration. He stepped closer, lowering his voice as if hoping the crowd wouldn't hear. "You think you've won them over?" he hissed. "This doesn't change the fact that you're still—" "A better man than you?" Peter interrupted, stepping between them. His voice was sharp, but his posture was steady, radiating the same quiet strength he had learned from his father. "Because that's exactly what he is." George's mouth snapped shut, and Peter didn't back down. "I've listened to you insult him all night," Peter said. "I've watched you try to tear him down just to make yourself feel bigger. But it didn't work, did it? Because my father doesn't need money or status to prove his worth. And honestly, neither do I." Emily stepped beside him, her voice equally firm. "And neither do I." George faltered, his gaze shifting to Margaret, but she offered no support. Instead, she lowered her eyes, clearly rattled by the shifting tide of the room. Thomas stepped forward, his voice softer now but no less powerful. "This isn't about winning," he said. "It's about understanding, about letting go of the fear that makes us build walls instead of bridges. I've been judged my whole life for the color of my skin, for the work I do, for the choices I've made. But tonight isn't about judgment. It's about love." He turned to Peter and Emily, his eyes shining. "And love doesn't need anyone's permission to exist." The room erupted in applause once more, but this time it felt final. It wasn't just for Thomas's words, but for the stand he had taken, for dignity, for resilience, and for the kind of strength that couldn't be bought or sold. George and Margaret retreated quietly, their defeat evident in the way their shoulders slumped as they disappeared into the crowd. The guests began to mingle again, but this time the conversations were different. Instead of whispers and judgments, there were questions about Thomas's past, about the painting, about the legacy he had chosen to preserve. Peter turned to his father, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Dad, for everything." Thomas smiled. "You don't have to thank me, son. Just promise me one thing. Anything. Build something better. For yourselves, for your children, and never let anyone make you feel like you don't belong." Peter nodded, and Emily slipped her hand into his. Together, they stepped forward, ready to face whatever came next, not as victims of prejudice, but as champions of love and equality. And as Thomas watched them, standing tall beneath the glow of the chandeliers, he knew that his legacy would endure, not in the form of wealth or status, but in the values he had passed down. Values that no amount of money could ever buy. The echoes of applause still lingered as guests began to drift back to their conversations, though the mood in the hall had shifted dramatically. The tension that had simmered throughout the evening had given way to an air of uncertainty, as though the very foundations of the gathering had been shaken. Yet, amidst the hum of quiet discussions and the occasional clink of glasses, Thomas remained a steady presence. Standing beside the Delacroix painting, his hands resting lightly on its frame, he seemed unbothered by the stares and murmurs that followed him. His composure was unshaken, even as George and Margaret retreated to the corner of the room, their faces drawn and pale. Peter and Emily stood close by, their hands intertwined, a physical representation of the unity that had carried them through the evening's trials. Peter's jaw was set, his gaze flickering between his father and George, while Emily's grip on his hand tightened, as if bracing herself for what was to come. George, however, was not finished. With measured steps, he approached the couple, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes dark with unspoken resentment. Margaret followed a few steps behind, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Peter, Emily," George began, his voice low but firm, "may I speak with you for a moment?" Peter exchanged a quick glance with Emily before nodding. "Go ahead." George's gaze shifted toward Thomas, lingering there for just a beat too long before he turned back to the couple. "I think we can all agree that tonight hasn't gone exactly as planned," he said, his words carefully chosen. "But there's still time to set things right." Peter frowned. "Set things right?" "Yes," George replied. "I understand that emotions are running high, and perhaps things were said in the heat of the moment. But we need to think about the future, the bigger picture." "The bigger picture?" Emily repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief. "What does that even mean, Dad?" "It means," George said, his voice tightening, "that you can't base your future on emotions alone. You have to consider stability, reputation, and what's best for your family." Peter stepped forward, his shoulders squaring. "And what exactly are you implying, George?" George hesitated, his composure wavering for the first time. "I'm saying that this, marriage, needs to be approached realistically. Emily has a certain lifestyle, certain expectations, and I'm not convinced that you can meet them." Peter's eyes darkened. "Are you serious? After everything that's happened tonight, you're still trying to control this?" "It's not about control," George snapped, his voice rising. "It's about ensuring that my daughter doesn't throw away her future on—" "On what?" Emily interrupted, stepping between them. "On someone who loves me, who respects me, who treats me like an equal instead of a possession?" George recoiled as though struck. "Emily—" "No," she said firmly, "I've had enough. Enough of your arrogance, enough of your prejudice, and enough of you trying to decide what's best for me." Margaret stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Emily, please. We're just worried about you." "Worried about me?" Emily laughed bitterly. "No, you're worried about yourselves, about what people will think, about whether this marriage fits into your perfect little world." She turned to Peter, her eyes shining with determination. "But I don't care about any of that. I care about you." Peter's expression softened, and he reached for her hand. "I care about you too. And I'm done letting them make us feel like we have to prove ourselves." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but George's expression hardened. "If you go through with this," he said quietly, "you'll regret it. You'll lose everything we've given you." Emily lifted her chin. "Then I guess I'll just have to build something better." The silence that followed was deafening. Guests turned away, pretending not to eavesdrop, but their ears remained tuned to every word. George and Margaret stood frozen, their faces pale, as if the ground had shifted beneath them. And in that moment, Peter and Emily made their choice. "We're leaving," Peter said, his voice steady. "We're done with this." Emily nodded. "Let's go." Thomas stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on Peter's shoulder. "I'm proud of you, son," he said softly. Peter smiled, and together they turned toward the door. The crowd parted as they passed, their murmurs fading into the background. George called out one last time, "Emily, don't do this." But Emily didn't look back. Outside, the cool night air greeted them like a balm. The stars stretched endlessly overhead, a reminder of just how small the evening's drama really was in the grand scheme of things. Peter exhaled slowly, his grip on Emily's hand tightening. "Are you okay?" She smiled through her tears. "Better than I've ever been." Thomas joined them, the painting carefully wrapped once more and tucked under his arm. "You did the right thing," he said, "and you're not alone. Whatever happens next, we'll face it together." Peter nodded. "Thank you, Dad, for everything." Thomas smiled, his expression filled with pride. "You don't have to thank me, son. Just promise me you'll keep building something worth fighting for." Peter looked at Emily, then back at his father. "I promise." As they walked into the night, leaving behind the glittering lights and whispered judgments of the reception hall, they carried with them more than just the painting. They carried the weight of their decisions, the strength of their convictions, and the knowledge that true family wasn't defined by blood or wealth, but by love, loyalty, and the courage to stand up for what was right. And for the first time in his life, Thomas felt truly free, not because of the painting or the wealth it represented, but because he had seen his son embrace the values he had fought so hard to instill. Together, they stepped forward into a new beginning, leaving behind the echoes of the past and walking boldly toward the future. The morning light poured through the windows, casting a warm glow over the small living room where Thomas sat with Peter and Emily. The Delacroix painting rested in its place of honor above the mantel, its colors alive in the soft sunlight. It was more than just art now. It was a testament to resilience, survival, and the quiet strength that had carried them through the storm of the previous night. Emily sat beside Peter on the couch, her fingers intertwined with his as they sipped coffee and exchanged quiet glances. The tension that had weighed so heavily on their shoulders at the wedding had lifted, replaced by a calm certainty. They had chosen love, dignity, and freedom over expectations, and as they sat together in this modest home, it already felt like the right choice. Thomas watched them, a quiet pride warming his chest. He had spent his life fighting for moments like this, moments where love triumphed over fear, where character mattered more than appearances, and where legacy was measured not in wealth, but in the values passed down. Peter set his cup down and turned to his father. "I keep thinking about last night," he said, "about how you stood there and faced them without ever raising your voice. I don't know how you did it." Thomas smiled, leaning back in his chair. "Because anger doesn't change hearts, son. Only truth can do that. And sometimes the truth doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to be steady." Emily leaned forward, her voice soft but resolute. "Do you think they'll ever change? My parents, I mean." Thomas studied her for a moment before answering. "Maybe, maybe not. Change takes time and not everyone's ready for it. But that doesn't mean you wait for them to catch up. You move forward and you show them what's possible. Sometimes the best way to change someone is to live in a way they can't ignore." Peter nodded, his jaw tightening. And if they don't, then you keep building, Thomas said. You build something better. That's the legacy you leave. Not what you inherit, but what you create. Emily smiled at that, her hand tightening around Peter's. I think we're ready for that. Thomas looked at them both, seeing the strength in their eyes, the same strength he had fought to instill in Peter since the day he was born. He rose from his chair and walked to the mantel, his fingers brushing the edge of the painting. This, he said, gesturing to it, is a reminder of where we've come from, of the struggles that shaped us. But it's not the legacy I want you to carry. Peter frowned. It's not? Thomas shook his head. No, the real legacy isn't hanging on a wall, it's sitting right here. He looked at Peter, then at Emily. It's in the choices you make and the lives you touch. This painting is just a symbol. The real inheritance is what you build together. Emily blinked back tears, and Peter rose to his feet. He walked over to his father and pulled him into a tight embrace. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Thomas patted his son's back, his own voice steady. You don't have to thank me. Just make it count. The three of them stood together for a moment, bound not by blood alone, but by the strength of their choices and the unshakable foundation of love and respect. As the day stretched on, laughter began to fill the small house. Plans for the future unfolded, dreams of a home, of children, of a life built on their own terms. And through it all, Thomas remained there, a steady presence, offering guidance but never interference. The Delacroix painting stayed above the mantel, but it was no longer the centerpiece of their story. Instead, it became a quiet reminder of where they had been and a symbol of what they would continue to build, together. And as Thomas sat back, listening to their voices fill the space around him, he knew his work wasn't finished. It had only just begun. If you like this story, support our channel, subscribe and click on the bell to not miss new releases. Watch other videos on our channel for more inspiring and exciting stories. Share this video with your friends and family. Maybe it will touch them as much as it touches you. Thank you for being with us.